Picture this. New York City is alive the way only New York can be loud. Restless, bleeding noise from every corner. The days are getting longer. And somewhere in the heart of Manhattan, a 28-year-old woman named Trisha Meili laces up her running shoes, steps out of her apartment, and heads into Central Park for her evening jog. She is an investment banker, disciplined, fit, a regular on this route. What she does not know, what nobody could have known, is that she will not come home tonight, and that before the week is over. 5 boys between the ages of 14 and 16 will have their entire lives destroyed for something they did not do. This is the story of the Central Park 5. Real people, real injustice, real failures of a system that is supposed to protect the innocent. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because what is coming in parts 2, 3, and 4 of this case is going to leave you completely speechless. Now, let us go back to 1989. To understand what happened to those 5 boys, you first have to understand the city they were growing up in. New York in 1989 is almost unrecognizable from the city it is today. Crime was peaking. The year before this story takes place, 1988, recorded 1,896 homicides, a record at the time. Muggings were so common they barely made the news. Central Park, one of the most iconic public spaces on earth, had become somewhere ordinary. New Yorkers thought twice about entering alone after dark. The police were under enormous pressure. Newspapers were running front-page crime stories daily. And into that city, into that climate of fear and racial tension, 5 boys from East Harlem had the worst possible luck of being in the wrong place on the wrong night. Their names were Raymond Santana, 14 years old, and Antron McCray, 15, and Corey Wise, 16. Neighborhood kids. Raymond liked drawing. Kevin loved football. Corey, the oldest, only came to the park that night because he wanted to walk alongside his friend Youssef. He had no reason to be there, and that single, ordinary act of friendship would cost him the next 13 years of his life. On the evening of April 19th, a group of roughly 30 teenagers from East Harlem entered Central Park near the northern end. Some of them were looking for trouble, and some of them found it. A man carrying groceries was attacked. A couple on a tandem bicycle was assaulted. Another jogger was beaten. It was chaotic, dangerous, criminal behavior by a large group of unsupervised teenagers in the dark. The 5 boys who would become the Central Park 5 were part of this wider group. They were in the park that night. That is the truth, and it matters to say it honestly. And that distinction, right there, is the entire foundation of one of the greatest injustices in American legal history. Raymond Santana and Kevin Richardson, both 14, were picked up by police at around 10:15 p.m. on Central Park West. At that point, the officers arresting them had no idea that Trisha Meili existed. The boys were being held for unlawful assembly, low-level charges, the kind that typically end with a ticket and a court date. They were scared, but this was manageable. Then, somewhere between 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 men walking through the park found something in a ravine in the northern section of the park that changed everything. Trisha Meili was barely alive. She had lost 75% of her blood. She was so unrecognizably damaged that investigators could not immediately identify who she was. For the first several hours, she was known only as the female jogger. The moment that news reached the precinct where Raymond and Kevin were sitting, everything changed completely. The desk appearance tickets went in the bin, because now there was a woman clinging to life in a hospital bed, and there were teenagers from that same park already in custody. Detectives did not start the investigation fresh. They focused on the boys they already had. Antron McCray and Youssef Salam were brought in shortly after, identified by other kids as having been in the park that night. And then Corey Wise walked in voluntarily, simply accompanying his friend Youssef, and never walked back out a free person. What happened inside those interrogation rooms over the next 14 to 30 hours is one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of American criminal justice. These were children, and they were placed in rooms with seasoned homicide detectives and questioned about one of the most high-profile violent crimes in the city's recent memory, with no attorney present and, for significant stretches, no parent in the room. Once the prosecutor overseeing the case heard about the attack on Meili, she instructed detectives to push the questioning toward the rape and to detain the teenagers. What began as seemingly routine questioning quickly turned aggressive and forceful. Detectives used physical intimidation, shouting, threats, and lies. They were told the DNA had already come back. They were told if they just cooperated, they could go home. But to a 14-year-old in a concrete room at 3 in the morning, awake for over 24 hours, with no one in his corner who could tell him what his rights were, the walls feel like they are closing in. And at some point, the calculus becomes unbearably simple. If I say yes, this ends. Every single one of the 5 boys retracted their confessions the moment the interrogations were over. They told anyone who would listen that they had been pressured, manipulated, and lied to. But the retractions came too late. 4 of the 5 had already given statements on videotape, and those tapes were now in the hands of the prosecution. The road that led to those tapes, the sleep deprivation, the threats, the hours of psychological pressure, none of that had been recorded. What the cameras captured was only the product. And here is the detail that should have stopped this case dead in its tracks before it ever reached a courtroom. When forensic scientists tested the DNA evidence recovered from Trisha Mealy at the crime scene, they got a result. A clear, unambiguous result. The DNA belonged to one unidentified male, and it matched none of the 5 boys, not one of them. There was no physical evidence of a group attack, no forensic trace of any of the 5 defendants at the location where Mealy was found. The physical evidence, read honestly and without pressure, told one story. These 5 boys were not there, but the city was not reading evidence honestly, and the newspapers had already decided who these boys were. Within days, the word Wilding was splashed across every front page in New York. A word the police claimed they had heard the teenagers used to paint a picture of savage, animalistic young men hunting through the dark. The 5 boys, all minors whose identities were supposed to be legally protected, were photographed and named publicly before they had been formally charged with anything. And then, on May 1, 1989, a full-page advertisement appeared in all 4 of New York's major daily newspapers: The Times, The Daily News, The Post, and Newsday. It was paid for by a real estate developer named Donald Trump, and it called for the return of the death penalty in direct connection with what these 5 teenagers were alleged to have done. These boys had not been convicted. The most powerful media voice in the city had looked at 5 children and declared, in print, for millions of people to read over breakfast, that they deserved to die. Raymond was 14, Antron was 15, Corey was 16. They were sitting in cells, insisting they were innocent, with no one powerful enough to make anyone listen. And somewhere, in a laboratory, a DNA sample sat quietly with the complete answer to this entire case, pointing to a man who was still walking free, whose name nobody had yet thought to look for. By the time the trials began, the verdict had already been decided, not in a courtroom, not by a jury, but on the front pages of New York's newspapers, and in the living rooms of millions of people who had spent over a year being told exactly who these 5 boys were. The city had convicted them. The trials were, in the minds of most people following the case, a formality, but for Raymond Santana, Antron McCrae, Yusef Salaam, Kevin Richardson, and Corey Wise, those courtrooms were the last place left where someone, anyone, might look at the evidence honestly and see what it was actually saying. The prosecution made an early decision that would shape everything that followed. They split the 5 defendants into 2 separate trials. Antron McCrae, Yusef Salaam, and Raymond Santana would go first. Kevin Richardson and Corey Wise would follow a few months later. This was not a logistical convenience. It was a deliberate strategic calculation. Splitting the trials gave prosecutors full control over the order in which evidence was introduced. And more critically, it meant that if they won the first case, that verdict would hang silently over the second trial, like a judgment already delivered, making it psychologically harder for a second jury to land somewhere different. Win the first, and the second almost takes care of itself. The first trial opened on June 25, 1990, in a Manhattan courtroom before Judge Thomas B. Galligan. The scene outside the courthouse was unlike almost anything New York had seen around a criminal case. Protesters gathered on the steps daily. People shouted at lawyers arriving for hearings. The racial tension that had been smoldering since the night of the attack crackled through every session. This was no longer really a trial about evidence and law. It had become a symbol, a battleground where 2 completely different stories about what had happened in that park were fighting for dominance, and where the atmosphere in the street made calm, clear-eyed evaluation of facts very nearly impossible before anyone had even sat down in a jury box. The prosecution team was led by Arthur Clements, with Elizabeth Lederer assisting. Both of them knew precisely what they had and what they did not have. They knew the DNA from the crime scene excluded all 5 defendants. They knew the confessions were riddled with internal contradictions. They knew not a single eyewitness had placed any of these 5 boys at the specific location in the park where Trisha Mealy was found. What they had, what the entire prosecution rested on, like a building balanced on a single cracked pillar, were those videotaped statements. 4 of the 5 boys had been recorded on camera, and the prosecution's plan was simple and brutally effective. Play those tapes to the jury, and let the human voice do what no forensic argument ever could. The defense attorneys worked hard. They challenged the confessions relentlessly, pointing to the inconsistencies with the kind of precise, patient repetition that legal work requires. They argued that these were children who had been held for extraordinary lengths of time without lawyers, psychologically ground down by detectives who lied to them about the evidence and promised them they could go home if they cooperated. They called the jury's attention to the specific errors in the boys' accounts, wrong locations, wrong timelines, wrong details that any real participant in that crime would have known without hesitation. One boy described events in an order that contradicted the physical evidence. Another placed the attack in a section of the park that was geographically inconsistent with where Trisha Mealy was actually found. Real perpetrators do not make these kinds of mistakes about crimes they personally committed. People who are guessing, who are trying to reconstruct something they never witnessed, make exactly these mistakes. The prosecution had a smooth answer for every inconsistency. The crime was chaotic. Memory under stress is imperfect. Multiple people committing a crime do not always observe or retain the same details. It sounded reasonable. It was not, under scrutiny, actually convincing, but it did not need to be convincing under scrutiny. It needed only to provide the jury with enough of an explanation to justify the conclusion they were already leaning toward, and the prosecutors understood that perfectly. Trisha Mealy herself testified at the first trial. She had survived. She had fought her way back from injuries that should have killed her, and her presence in that courtroom commanded the kind of respect and sympathy that nothing else in the proceedings could match. But legally, she offered the prosecution almost nothing. She had no memory of the night of the attack. The assault itself was completely absent from her recollection, a common consequence of the severe traumatic brain injury she had suffered. She could not identify any of the defendants. She could not describe her attacker. She could not corroborate a single specific detail from any of the confessions. She was, in the starkest legal sense, not a witness to what the defendants were alleged to have done, because she had seen nothing. The defense attorneys chose not to cross-examine her, sensing correctly how badly challenging a survivor in front of a jury would play, and so she left the stand having added nothing to either side of the case. Her presence was powerful. Her testimony was empty. After 10 days of deliberation, the first jury delivered its verdict on August 18, 1990. Antron McRae, Yusef Salam, and Raymond Santana were each acquitted of attempted murder, the most serious charge, but convicted of rape, assault, and robbery. The courtroom erupted. Outside, people cheered. Inside, 3 families absorbed what had just happened to their children. Yusef Salam, standing as the verdict was read, called it a legal lynching. He was not wrong. He had been one of the most resistant of all 5 during the interrogation. His mother had actually arrived at the precinct in time to pull him out of the room before a written statement could be signed, and he had refused to put his name to a confession. It had made absolutely no difference. The videotaped portion the prosecution had captured was enough. The second trial began on October 22, 1990, with Kevin Richardson and Corey Wise in the dock. Elizabeth Lederer now led the prosecution with full authority over the case. She opened with a lengthy, detailed statement outlining exactly what the prosecution contended these 2 boys had done. Before she had finished, Corey Wise broke down completely at the defense table, weeping, shouting at Lederer that she had lied, that she was making it up. He had to be removed from the courtroom temporarily. A motion for a mistrial was filed immediately by the defense, arguing that Wise's visible distress had irreparably poisoned the jury's perception of him before a single piece of evidence had been introduced. The judge rejected the motion and the trial continued. When Corey eventually took the stand and was asked to explain why he had confessed to something he insisted he had not done, his answer was 5 words that should have stopped the entire room. He said, "The detectives told me to." He described being promised that if he just said what they wanted, he could go home. He was 16. He had come to the precinct voluntarily. He had no prior serious criminal history. He had never sat across from a homicide detective in his life, and his account of what had happened during those interrogation hours was entirely consistent with everything his co-defendants had described from their own rooms on that same night. The second jury reached a result that split differently from the first. They were unconvinced by certain parts of Y's confession. They acquitted him of rape and attempted murder, returning instead convictions for sexual abuse, assault, and riot. It was a fractured verdict that, in different circumstances, might have been read as a signal that something about these cases did not hold up, but it was still a conviction. Kevin Richardson was found guilty on all counts, including rape and attempted murder. The jury cited the physical evidence, semen and grass stains on his clothing, and 2 hairs described as consistent with Trisha Mealy's found in his underwear. It was enough to push past the DNA exclusion, past the inconsistent confession, past the total absence of any witness placing him at the scene of the attack. The sentences were handed down. Antron McCrae, Yusef Salam, and Raymond Santana received 5 to 10 years each and was sent to a juvenile detention facility upstate. Kevin Richardson received the same. Corey Wise received 5 to 15 years, and because he was the oldest, classified as an adult at 16, he was sent not to any juvenile facility but directly to Rikers Island and later to adult state prison. He would serve his entire sentence in the adult system, surrounded by grown men, beginning when he was still a teenager. 5 convictions, 2 trials, no DNA match, no eyewitness, no forensic evidence at the crime scene tying any of them to the attack on Trisha Mealy. Just 5 broken confessions, a city that needed someone to blame, and 12 ordinary people in each jury room who, despite the inconsistencies, despite the missing evidence, despite everything the defense had laid in front of them, looked at those videotapes and decided that 5 boys could not possibly have said those things unless they were true. The real attacker watched it all happen from somewhere in the city. He knew exactly who was sitting in those prison cells. He knew exactly what he had done. And for 13 more years, he said nothing. While Raymond Santana, Antron McCrae, Yusef Salam, Kevin Richardson, and Corey Wise were serving their sentences, growing from boys into young men inside facilities they should never have entered, the man who had actually attacked Trisha Mealy in Central Park on the night of April 19, 1989, was still out there. He had a name. He had a face. He had, in fact, been known to the police long before those 5 boys ever walked into a precinct. And in the months following the attack, while the city was congratulating itself on swift justice served, he was not laying low or running scared. He was hunting again. His name was Matias Reyes. He was born in Puerto Rico in 1971 and had moved to New York City as a child. By the time of the Central Park attack, he was 17 years old, living in a van on a street in East Harlem and working at a convenience store just blocks from Central Park. He was not a ghost. He was not a mystery. He was a young man with a history of violent behavior who had already assaulted a woman near Central Park in 1988 and who had attacked and begun raping another woman in the exact same northern section of Central Park just 2 days before. Trisha Mealy was attacked on April 17, 1989. That victim had described her attacker clearly. She said he was Hispanic, with fresh stitches on his chin. A detective on that case had already checked hospital records and traced the description to Matias Reyes. His name was in a file. He was sitting right there, 2 days before the attack on Mealy, with a detective who had already identified him as a violent offender operating in that exact part of that exact park. But the April 17th victim left New York shortly after the attack and stopped cooperating with police. The detective assigned to her case was transferred to a different unit. The file was closed, and Matias Reyes was never brought in for questioning. When Trisha Mealy was found 2 days later, the investigation that followed never looked at him, because by then, the police believed they already had their perpetrators sitting in the precinct. The file on the April 17th rape and the file on the April 19th rape were never placed side by side. Nobody made the connection, and so Matias Reyes walked away, completely untouched, while 5 boys were dismantled by a system that could not see past the confessions it had manufactured. The summer of 1989, the same summer that Antron, Yusef, Raymond, Kevin and Corey were being processed through the courts, having their mugshots taken, having their names plastered across newspapers, Reyes went on a rampage. He raped 4 more women, forcing his way into their apartments, targeting women who lived alone. He murdered one of them, a pregnant mother of 3 named Lourdes Gonzalez, 24 years old, whom he stabbed 9 times in the chest and abdomen and once in the face, while her young children sat in the next room. He was eventually caught, convicted, and sentenced to 33.5 years to life in prison. He went in and he stayed in for over a decade. He said nothing about Trisha Mealy. He carried that secret through every prison transfer, every hearing, every year that passed. The 5 boys he knew were innocent, served their sentences, and were released. And still he said nothing. What changed was Corey Wise. In 2001, Matias Reyes was transferred to the Auburn Correctional Facility in upstate New York. Corey Wise was already there, the same Corey Wise who had walked into a police station at 16 to accompany his friend, and had never really walked back out. Corey had served his entire sentence in the adult prison system, which meant that while Antron, Yusef, Raymond and Kevin had done their time in juvenile detention facilities, Corey had spent years surrounded by grown men convicted of serious crimes, navigating a world that would have broken most people. He had been inside for over a decade by the time Reyes arrived at Auburn, and when Reyes encountered him, when he came face to face with a man whose entire youth had been swallowed by a crime that Reyes himself had committed, something shifted. According to accounts of what followed, Reyes and Wise had a prior interaction at another facility. They had even gotten into a fight over a prison television set at one point. 2 men in a world without space or comfort or peace, rubbing against each other without either one knowing the full weight of what connected them. But at Auburn, it became something else. Reyes began talking to a prison chaplain. He began, slowly, to reckon with what he had done. And in early 2002, he went to a corrections officer and said that he needed to talk. He had something to confess. The confession Matias Reyes gave in January 2002 was detailed, specific, and chilling. He told investigators that on the night of April 19, 1989, he had gone into Central Park alone. He described the attack on Trisha Mealy with the kind of precise, intimate detail that only a person who had actually been there could possibly know. Details about the location, about what he had used, about how the attack had unfolded, that had never been made public and that matched the physical evidence exactly. He said he had acted alone. No group, no gang, no wolf pack. One man acting alone, in the dark, in a park that a city was already terrified of. When investigators tested his DNA against the sample that had been sitting in that evidence file since 1989, the same sample that had excluded all 5 defendants at trial, the same sample the prosecution had explained away with the theory that the boys simply hadn't ejaculated. The match came back, confirmed to a factor of 1 in 6 billion people. Not a partial match, not a probable match. 1 in 6 billion, the only human being on Earth whose DNA matched what was found on Trisha Mealy was Matias Reyes. Further DNA testing on the hairs that had been found at the scene, including the hairs that had been presented at the second trial as physical evidence against Kevin Richardson, also matched Reyes. Those hairs had nothing to do with Kevin Richardson at all. The forensic expert who had told the jury they were consistent with Richardson's hair to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty had been wrong. The science that helped convict a 14-year-old boy had simply been wrong. The district attorney's office in Manhattan was notified of the confession. Robert Morgenthau, the Manhattan district attorney, appointed a team of assistant district attorneys to conduct a full investigation, to go back through every piece of evidence, every detail of the original confessions, every decision made by detectives and prosecutors in 1989 and 1990, and determine what had actually happened. What that investigation found was what the defense attorneys had been saying for over a decade. The confessions were false. The physical evidence pointed to one attacker who was not among the 5. The case against the Central Park 5 had never had a solid foundation. It had been built on interrogation tactics applied to children, on a city desperate for resolution, and on a public so primed by media and by politicians to see these 5 boys as guilty that no amount of inconsistent evidence had been enough to slow the machinery down. On December 19, 2002, New York Supreme Court Justice Charles J. Tejada vacated the convictions of all 5 men. Every charge, every count, gone. 13 years after Raymond Santana and Kevin Richardson had been picked up in Central Park for unlawful assembly. The system that had destroyed their lives quietly, formally, and with almost no fanfare acknowledged what it had done. The word used in the legal proceedings was vacated, a clean, bloodless, bureaucratic word for something that was anything but clean. It meant that in the eyes of the law, the convictions had never happened. It meant the men were innocent. What it could not mean, what no court order, no legal document, no press conference could ever mean, was that the years were given back. Raymond had been 14. He was 27 when his name was cleared. Yusef had been 15. Kevin had been 14. Antron had been 15, Corey had been 16, and had spent every single one of the 12.5 years since his arrest in the adult prison system. An experience so harrowing that people who knew him said he had come in as a boy and emerged as someone almost unrecognizable. There was one more detail about the exoneration that deserves to be stated plainly and without softening, because it is one of the most grotesque footnotes in this entire story. Because of the statute of limitations on the crime, the legal time limit within which charges must be brought, Matias Reyes was never charged with the rape of Trisha Mealy. He had already been convicted and sentenced for his other crimes. His confession was used to free the innocent men. The convictions were vacated in December 2002. The legal term vacated is one of the most bloodlessly inadequate words in the English language for what it actually means. It means the state looked at what it had done, acknowledged it was wrong, and erased the record. It does not mean it gave back what was taken. It does not mean it restored the years. It does not mean Raymond Santana got to grow up the way he should have. It does not mean Corey Wise got back the teenage years he spent in an adult prison surrounded by men convicted of murder and robbery, navigating violence every single day, alone, from the age of 16. The law said the convictions never happened. The men who carried those convictions in their bodies, in their minds, and on their records for over a decade knew exactly how much that piece of paper was and was not worth. When the 5 men walked out of the shadow of those convictions, the world they came back to was not the one they had left. Antron McCrae had missed his entire adolescence. He had gone in at 15 and come out in his early 20s, with a sex offender registration requirement and a conviction record that made finding legitimate work nearly impossible. He eventually relocated to Maryland and took a job in sanitation. Steady, honest work, the kind of work that requires you to show up every day and do something useful in the world. But the road to even that ordinary life had not been straight or easy. Raymond Santana came home to New York and found that the stigma of the conviction followed him everywhere, regardless of the exoneration, regardless of the DNA, regardless of the confession from the real perpetrator. Unable to find work, struggling financially, he began selling drugs. In 1998, before the exoneration had even happened, he was arrested and sentenced to 3.5 to 7 years, longer than a first-time offender would have received because of his prior record, the prior record being a wrongful conviction for a crime he had never committed. The system that had already destroyed him once managed, through the downstream consequences of its original failure, to destroy him again. Kevin Richardson and Yusef Salaam managed to find more stable footing after their release from juvenile facilities, but neither of them escaped unscathed. Yusef had served his time carrying the specific weight of being one of the most publicly vilified of the 5 during the original media frenzy. He rebuilt his life with extraordinary discipline and eventually became a community activist and public speaker. But the work of rebuilding required a kind of psychological endurance that most people will never be tested on. Kevin Richardson returned to life in New York quietly, working to put himself back together while the legal battles continued and while the city that had convicted him still had not formally acknowledged what it had done. And then there was Corey Wise. Of all 5 men, Corey's story is the one that most completely exposes the depth of what this case cost its victims. He had served 12.5 years in the adult prison system, longer than any of the others, longer by years, in a harder environment, beginning when he was 16 years old. He had a learning disability and a hearing impairment when he walked into that precinct in 1989. He emerged in 2002 as a man who had spent the entirety of his formative years inside a system designed not to rehabilitate, but to contain. He stayed in New York. He did not disappear. And when the $41 million settlement finally came through in 2014, Corey Wise took $190, zero of his own compensation, money he had received because 12.5 years of his life had been stolen, and donated it to fund an innocence project at the University of Colorado Law School, an organization dedicated to helping other wrongfully convicted people prove their innocence. They renamed the project in his honor, the Corey Wise Innocence Project. The boy who had walked into a police station voluntarily at 16 to walk his friend home and had lost everything for over a decade as a result, used the money the system gave him to try to make sure the same thing happened to fewer people going forward. In 2003, a year after the exoneration, the 5 men filed a civil lawsuit against the city of New York for malicious prosecution, racial discrimination, and emotional distress. They also sued the individual detectives and prosecutors who had worked toward their convictions. The lawsuit asked for $250 million. The city under Mayor Michael Bloomberg refused to settle for over a decade, refused year after year to formally acknowledge what had been done to these men, stonewalling the case through hearing after hearing, while Bloomberg's lawyers argued that the city believed it could win in court. Think about what that means. These 5 men had been exonerated. The real perpetrator had confessed. The DNA matched Matias Reyes and nobody else, and the city of New York was still fighting them in court, still spending public money on lawyers to avoid admitting what the evidence had already proven. It was not until 2014, when Mayor Bill de Blasio came into office, having specifically promised during his campaign to resolve the lawsuit, that the city finally agreed to settle. The settlement was $41 million, approximately $1 million for every year of wrongful imprisonment the 5 men had collectively served. Raymond Santana, Antron McCrae, Yusef Salaam, and Kevin Richardson each received $7.1 million. Corey Wise, who had served over a decade in the adult system, compared to the 5 to 7 years the others had served in juvenile facilities, received $12.2 million. The city settled without admitting any wrongdoing. Let that sit for a moment. $41 million paid to 5 men whose innocence had been proven beyond any scientific doubt. And the official position of the city of New York remained that it had done nothing wrong. It was not justice. It was the closest approximation of justice that the machinery of government was prepared to offer, which is a very different thing. The same man who in 1989 had taken out full-page ads in 4 New York newspapers demanding the death penalty for 5 teenagers who had not yet been tried, let alone convicted. When the $41 million settlement was announced in 2014, Trump wrote an opinion piece in the New York Daily News calling it a disgrace, saying the settlement was ridiculous and suggesting the men were likely still guilty. He wrote that settling does not mean innocence and urged people to speak to the detectives on the case. During his 2016 presidential campaign, he stated again, publicly, that the convictions should not have been vacated, that the Central Park 5 were guilty. In June 2019, when a reporter asked him directly if he would apologize to the men, given that the DNA had definitively identified the actual attacker, he said no. He said the men had admitted their guilt. He was referring to the coerced confessions of children that every court in the land had thrown out as the products of unlawful interrogation. He has never apologized. Not once. Not a single word. Yusef Salaam, the same boy who in 1990 had stood in a courtroom at 15 years old and called his conviction illegal lynching, issued a one-word public statement in response to the news of the indictment. The word was karma. Today, all 5 men are alive. Yusef Salaam became a New York City Council member in 2023, winning his election and taking a seat in the very government system that once tried to destroy him. Raymond Santana became a clothing designer and activist, using his platform to advocate for criminal justice reform. Kevin Richardson works as a youth mentor. And Corey Wise continues to speak publicly about wrongful convictions, about what the inside of an interrogation room does to a teenager, about what it feels like to lose 13 years to a system that never once stopped long enough to look honestly at the evidence in front of it. The Central Park 5 case did not end when the convictions were vacated. It did not end when the settlement was signed. It does not end because of a Netflix series or a documentary or a video essay. It is still happening, right now, in police stations and courtrooms across every country in the world. Wherever frightened people sit across tables from authority figures with no one in their corner. Wherever communities are primed by media to see certain kinds of faces as automatically guilty. Wherever the pressure to close a case moves faster than the obligation to close the right case. The names change, the cities change, the decades change. The machinery stays exactly the same. Yusef Salaam, Raymond Santana, Kevin Richardson, Antron McCrae, and Corey Wise survived it. Millions of people in their position, in other cases, in other years, did not. That is the full story of the Central Park 5. If this series hit you the way it was meant to, if you found yourself angry, or heartbroken, or unable to look away, then you already understand exactly why this channel exists. Every single week, there is another case like this one, another name, another family, another verdict delivered before the evidence was ever honestly examined. Subscribe right now so you do not miss a single one of them. Drop a comment below and tell me which wrongful conviction case you want covered next. I read every single one. and your suggestions directly shape what gets covered on this channel. Share this video with one person who has never heard this story, because the only thing that changes these cases over time is more people knowing they happened. The Central Park Five spent decades fighting to make sure the world knew the truth. The least we can do is make sure it keeps spreading.